I'd like to welcome everyone tonight. My name is Allison Saylor. I'm on the Thai Colorado board, and I'm the chair of our first ever Leadership Day that's going to be June 23rd this year up at our Copper Mountain Conference as part of the conference. We're very lucky to have obtained Pam Moran, who is a superintendent in Virginia, and Ian Socol, who works for Michigan State University, to be our keynotes for the day. And they're going to give us a sample of what we might hear that day, and they have some very interesting ideas about how our schools should be managed. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and I'm happy to have you all. Any questions that you want to ask, please put in the chat, and if they don't see them, I'll try and pass them on to Pam and Ian. So welcome, Pam and Ian. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm Ira Socol, and Pam Moran is also on. I'm in western Michigan, out on the Lake Michigan shoreline, more or less in finally sunny weather. Pam is in thunderstorms and tornado watches in central Virginia and Charlottesville. What we're going to talk about tonight, and we want to make this as much a group conversation as you guys want to make it, so please feel free to interrupt and comment and suggest and talk both in the chat room and raise your hand and say you want to speak. We're going to talk about the conflict between, and sort of a shift in concept and leadership, the conflict between scientifically managed schools and what we call community-driven schools. And I'll do this as a quick introduction in saying that in our minds and our observations, what we've seen is we're at a moment in history where communication systems and information systems have changed so radically that culture has changed. But we don't think that what we're moving to is something unknown. We think we're moving to something that the world knew very well up until the last couple of hundred years. That is, we tend to think that what some might call the Gutenberg era, some might call the Reformation era, certainly we could call it the Industrial Revolution era, created forms of communication and forms of education and forms of leadership in communities unlike those from the period before and we think the period after. The scientific management systems that grew up with the Gutenberg era, the Industrial Revolution era, were designed to operate sort of separate from the way human communities had operated in the past. And leadership was developed in different ways. And we're living with that now, even though we're in a period now where the rules have changed back, where information is not controlled by a system where people can gather however they want to in whatever ways, where print is just one of the many forms in which information is transferred, and in which power systems have started to shift because the communications systems have shifted. So from there, we're sort of off into how we see schools operate, and I'll turn it over to Pam and get her first thoughts.
Well, I think that one of the pieces that I would like to start with is a story, and I think it's a story of how the world is changing for us in terms of the way that we communicate and operate as leaders. And it goes to a situation that occurred recently where one of the staff members that I work with as a senior staff member went out to a school to work with a group of parents around something that typically we would be sharing with a parent-teacher organization about a possible change in the way that we were working with that school. And as he presented and talked and shared data and talked about this particular event that we were looking towards, all of a sudden he realized that one of the folks in the group, one of the parents, was texting on her mobile device. Pretty soon, she started asking questions. Turns out that she was texting with her husband, who happened to be an expert in this area, and it turned the meeting from something that was a presentation by senior staff to a group of parents into a very different kind of conversation. I think that one of the things that strikes me in this day and age is that no matter where we are, whether we're a principal in a school, whether we're a superintendent, whether we're a assistant superintendent or a teacher in a classroom, that those traditional kinds of hierarchies that we're used to, sort of the factory school model, is getting taken apart around us, and that the reality is that we're still using a really old system of industrial approaches to teaching and learning, to running schools, to running school districts, that at some level is not working for us at this point in time, and maybe never did work, but particularly in this day and age is changing radically, and we are not responding to that. We are not really looking at our world through the lens that we are, again, more of a face-to-face community, and are being made that way to some extent by the way the virtual world is developing.
One of the things that we think is important to note is the role technology has played in this, and Pam's story is a perfect example of it. For right now, for example, so Pam and I can see each other, even though we're in different places, and Illuminate doesn't have that sort of shared video feature. We are on a Skype call at the same time, and in a corner of our screens we can see each other while we're talking to you. One of the things that technology does is it has actually, despite the fact that you hear constant complaints from certain people about the fact that it separates people from the real world, it really connects people in a way we haven't had an opportunity to connect in a long time. For example, if this was 300 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution reshaped communities and created sort of the anonymity of cities, then I would have spent my whole life with my family, my parents, my siblings, my child. They would have been part of my daily life, hour by hour, minute by minute. I would have known everything that was going on. During the last couple of 100 years, that became very difficult. People ended up even on different continents, in different places, and very scattered, and we did not have access to them on a constant level. But what technology of the present day has given us is that old world back in a significant way, so that I know where my son is all the time by watching Foursquare and Twitter. Even though he lives in New York and I'm here, I can communicate with my mother who's in Florida every day, and my siblings who are in New York and Texas, and cousins around the world, and Pam who's in Virginia. And I see people and touch them and know what's going on, just like sort of in the real old days. That has recreated this sort of ancient form of sort of natural leadership, in which leaders, if you watch social networks, arise via their demonstrated competence and ability to contribute to a community. If you watch who becomes the respected voices in a place like Twitter, in sort of professional learning communities, it is not based on credentials. It's not based on where you went to college anymore. It's not based on who publishes your books. It's based on whether you can give effective information to people that they can use. That's a very old model of leadership, and that's one of the things we're starting to talk about here.
Well, and I would add to that, Ira, that one of the things that really worries me is that we live in a day and age where we are basing a lot of the work, in fact, almost all of the work we do, on what one of the folks that I followed back in the 80s, out of the business world, interestingly, W. Edwards Deming, who talked about that organizations that base their progress on numbers alone, visible numbers alone, aren't going to be able to make the kinds of process improvements that really lead to people that work in the organization feeling like that they are owners of the work, people feeling like that they're part of a collaborative team, that they're all in it together as a community versus seeing themselves in silos. And most importantly, one of the things that he really went after is that when you're working inside an institution, a factory, or a school, and people feel like they're competing with each other, whether it's kids or teachers, that what you don't get to do is to really leverage the collective intelligence of the group. And I just feel like that one of the things that we've set in motion through a scientific management model is such a focus on trying to run our systems based on numbers alone that we've really neglected the idea that as leaders that we're out for the good of the community, and it's when everybody is successful, all teachers are successful, all kids in a school are really feeling a high level of success, that we're really going to turn around some of the bigger issues that people in this country are saying happens to be the ills of public education. The reality is that I look at it, you know, and I heard the Secretary of Education say that in this next year that 80+% of the schools in the United States would be labeled as failures, that if No Child Left Behind stays in place in 2 years, 98% will be failures. That sounds like really bad news. I think on the other hand, the good news is that we don't have schools that are out there that are failures at that level. We all know that there are improvements that need to be made, but I don't think that trying to do that through silos, competition, visible numbers alone, and keeping people apart from each other in the work they're doing is what's going to help us get there. And I'd love to see some of the folks in the chat room log in and respond to that.
One of the things that I think is critical is the entire competitive theory that runs through everything. You know, and President Obama and Secretary Duncan used the terms race to the top. And when I challenged them on this, saying that, you know, when you have a race, you inevitably have winners and losers. And that is a basic problem. One of the things that you see, and I remember long ago in a conference about community development, somebody describing the difference between a small town and a big city. And one of the ways in which they said small villages worked more effectively is when you had smaller populations and you had less of a technological base to operate, you needed the contributions of every person in the community. Sure, the person might be the town drunk, but they could also help you, you know, get your plumbing done if you could keep them sober for enough of the day, or they could do this or that. They could work through things. And surely this person might not be the smartest person in the village, but they found something very useful for them to do. There's a range of uses and needs and supports that work through this. But in big cities, in the scientifically managed thing, you can afford to throw people away. And so when you have races to the top, when you have competitive-based funding for schools, Michigan's governor just unveiled that today in big things, when you say that you're creating charter schools so that parents can pick the successful things, it means you're creating environments where many of the children are not successful. And when we do this in schools, through the many things we do, from grading to honor rolls to academic awards to things like that, we're always, you know, creating losers. One of the things that I always stick with and that I always remember is in my second grade classroom, so I was, 7 years old, but the teacher had a bulletin board that basically had little fish with student names on it. The fish moved up the tank as you read books. The more books you read, the higher up in the tank you got. And of course, my fish ended up stuck at the bottom of the tank for the entire year. I still remember this, decades later. And we do this to kids every day. We do it to teachers every day. We have to, you know, we have to rethink how we lead so that we're not leaving large groups of our population behind.
And I think that Leslie just brought up in the chat room, Ira, that she thinks that we ought to really work to see kids solving real-life problems and not being so focused or on grades or even looking at what it would look like if we eliminated grades. I think that's a really important point, because one of the things, and I certainly would love to hear from some folks in the chat room, that I think that grades become a mechanism for sorting and selecting, and that as soon as we start sorting and selecting, one of the things that we do is to really opt some kids out of learning the things that we think are really important for kids to learn. And that happens in a lot of different ways. But I think that the critical issue is that we've defined school as a place where our job is not to ensure that everybody learns, but to simply ensure that everybody teaches.
Well, and I've been lucky enough in my life to go to a couple of things, both a high school and college without grades. And one of the things that's wondrous about that is that it becomes about the project and the work you're doing, and the hierarchy of students that usually occurs in schools disappears in those cases. And these were very successful educational institutions, so I know I have evidence that this kind of grading doesn't work, that honoring people for what they do is a much stronger incentive because it allows sort of everyone to succeed. So if you have a grading system, it doesn't matter. For instance, when I teach at Michigan State, it's almost impossible in my classes to get anything below a 3.5, with 4 being the top, and those are the two grade choices, and most people get a 4. And I say that at the beginning, and I go through it, and yet people still worry about it because the university will get very upset if I give everybody the same thing in a 70-person class. So we create barriers the minute we introduce that ranking of students, and when we create ranking of teachers in the same way, we obviously, do the same thing. I mean, one of the things that I always like to focus on is I have a real good friend, a professor at Michigan State, who says the hidden curriculum of schools is never hidden. It is actually the only curriculum. It is the way you rank and sort people. It is the way you measure people that is the curriculum of the school. That's what people respond to. The rest is just trivial facts and things around it in most schools. But what matters to people, what they learn, is the environment you create.
Absolutely, and you kind of zipped past the hierarchy slide in terms of leadership, because I look at that from the level of being a person at the superintendency and level, and think about the fact that one of the things that we've done, and I certainly was very aware of this as a young teacher, is that we attach status to what the position happens to be inside the educational hierarchy. And that rather than looking at knowledge of particular issues or situations or considerations that we need to have in education, we look at who in the hierarchy has the positional power, and that's who oftentimes gets to make the decision. The reality is that if you go out and take a look at an organization that has, we've got, 20-some hundred employees, I can find teachers that perhaps in some cases have as much knowledge, if not more knowledge, than perhaps some of the more senior members of the administrative team. And yet, one of the things that we do by structuring that hierarchy, it's almost as if we send the message that what you know is far less important than the position you hold. I really think when I go back and take a look at maybe what you would label, Ira, as the pre-Gutenberg period of time, that the reality is, if you go back to villages, tribes, whatever, that in the very, very old days, that it was what people knew and could do that defined sometimes the level of power that they had inside the community. It shifted around based upon the situation. We don't do that. We tend to line it up based upon where do you sit in that hierarchy. So as superintendent, you have far more power over the organization than you would at any other point up and down that line. That, I think, is something that we really should be thinking about, is how do we level that playing field so that more people can come to the table with what they know and understand about situations and be able to really leverage all of that intellect together to make sure we're making good decisions. So, you know, what is it that leaders do to break down that hierarchy is a great question.
Well, and because what's so important about that is how it filters down. And Jason asked in the chat room, he said that we have, you know, he has students, more often boys than girls, who feel that what they are good at is not valued at all by the school. And I have a favorite thing from a Australian educator friend of mine who once said on Twitter, you know, how do I say to parents, your son is doing really well at everything that the school doesn't consider important? You know, he's smiling, he's interacting with his peers, he's functioning, he's contributing sort of knowledge in a back channel kind of way, and none of that is valued at all. And of course, when we start by not valuing that in our teaching staff, in the parents, in everybody in our learning community, that of course filters down to the students, that only certain things are valued. I always ask people who work in schools that have honor rolls, what goes into putting someone on an honor roll? Why isn't it everything? You know, and my example as somebody who really struggled with reading in school is, you know, I would say to some people, you know how clumsy you felt in your gym class? Well, that's the way I felt many more hours of the day. So that what we do is we rank people. We rank people in the organization in a way that, just as Pam said, limits their potential for contributing to us, so their knowledge is discounted, or it simply isn't listened to. And when that happens a couple of times, people stop contributing, they stop trying, and the same thing happens to students in the classroom. And we have to change this from the very start. Leadership should not mean either control of everything or power over everything or all-knowing. Those things are not leadership. Leadership is learning to empower people to go on their own and contribute what they know, so that as a community, our collective intelligence, our community cognition is the best it can be. And this is sort of, you know, the critical thing. If your principal's office, your superintendent's office looks like the door in this slide, there's a problem, because if we talk about natural leadership in the way we mean it, one of the things in this slide that, and I think this is important, that these 5 people, and I could say if I wanted to do this, you know, extra credit to the first person to name them, but none of these people were born into leadership positions. None of these people rose through normal systems. What they all have in common is that they filled a particular need within their community at that moment in time, and thus they rose to the top in their situations. And that's a really vital thing to, you know, to think about, is how people move through your organization, how they bring knowledge to the table, their skills to the table all the time. And so, you know, and we're not going to talk slides much in this, but, you know, the question then becomes what the leaders do. If you measure, what do you measure? Because whatever you measure will be the most important thing in your school. Do you inspire? Do you bring people, you know, to be their best all the time? Do you direct people, or do you support them in their own directions? Do you make rules, or do you make things possible? And
I would say that I also think that one of the things that you have to really be able to talk about is, if you go back to the whole basics of scientific management, which started 100 years ago, about this time, I think, Ira, that it was all about looking at kids as products. In fact, Coverly, who Ira knows quite a bit more about than I do, really believed that schools should be run as business by business people, He believed that everything should be governed and managed by what we might call SMART goals today. He believed very specifically should be focused on in such a way that it was always about results that were measurable, that he was very much into seeing schools run just like factories were beginning to be run during that period of time. And what concerns me is that we've tried to repeat that model over and over again in response to any point in the time between then and now where people have felt like that schools were not working very well. And the reality is that I think that the system is what I would label as being the failure, not the people, either the kids or the teachers or the principals that are working inside the system. We just keep trying to replicate something that hasn't worked very well for us. It's interesting because the 9/11 Commission, when they took apart what about government they felt had led to 9/11, and I certainly don't want to characterize us as being a 9/11 situation with our schools today, but they looked at 4 areas that I think are pretty critical. They said that there were failures of management, of capacity, of policy, and of imagination. And they talked about, you know, the government working in silos. They talked about people that had knowledge, that had the capacity to perhaps inform what was going on, were kind of ignored inside the system. They talked about the fact that we just couldn't imagine that the world was no longer a Cold War world, and so our policies were built around that. I think in some ways that we have to take a look at those same kinds of failures inside our own system: policy, capacity, management, and imagination, and think about if those are failures of our system, what do we replace them with? And so that's really what we've been trying to work on a little bit together, whether it's looking at learning spaces, whether it's looking at teaching, whether it's looking at the learning work that kids are doing or how the technologies are used, and realizing that you can't separate those things out from each other, that you've got to look at it as a system of ways that we need to change, and that we can't do it by using the traditions of schools, whether it's traditional professional development, whether it's traditional leadership hierarchies, whether it's traditional sorting and selecting or schedules, that we really got to take that apart and figure out what do we do that really starts to move us away from traditions that are part of what some people might label as a failed system.
Well, you know, one of the things that's important to follow along this is that the scientific system continuously cut down the number of things that were measured. And they said they were doing this specifically. They stopped looking at the kind of natural sort of leadership kind of thing you'd see among kids. They stopped looking at, different kinds of learning that were outside the sort of 5 critical areas that were defined as academic subjects. They stopped looking at people's normal progress as they learned and started associating that with age-based norms. And this was a battle throughout the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, usually between educators who argued very firmly that teachers knew their students. You didn't have to do standardized tests to do this. In fact, American educators were quite sure of this, and many British observers commented that American schools were better than British schools because British schools had already begun by 1900 to teach to the test, and American schools really didn't do that yet. There was if you go back further to the one-room schoolhouse from which, education began, then much was done in terms of peer teaching, and people had to depend on the community to help, educate in different ways. All of that went by the wayside with the Coverley system, and it's not really his, but he was the one who codified it, while he was headed this Stanford College of Education. The concept that schools were factories producing products, which is what you still hear today. And if you do that, if you believe that, then your education is guaranteed to throw a high number of people of students away. That's always been the process. The reason we have age-based grades in schools is because the goal of schooling, and I think Woodrow Wilson said this most explicitly, was to fail 80% of students. And you failed about 10% of students every year, 1st through 8th grade, and you got down to the 20% who went to high school at that point. That is the goal of grade level expectations. It is the goal of standardized testing. It is the goal of auditing. And if that's the structure that's out there, then you're going to rank your teachers as industrial workers. That is, it's no different than if you're working on the line at, the old GM factories in Flint, Michigan. You're going to be ranked on how many cars you produce that, fall off the end of the line, not how you lift products up, you lift students up and make things better. So the very basis of the scientific management, and remember that we use, just as a way of driving this home, when we do statistical analysis of our educational statistics, of our testing results, we use what's called the t-test. And the t-test was designed by a chemist working for Guinness to assure that every batch of beer was exactly the same. That's our standard, and if that's our standard, it affects how we rank students, and it clearly affects how we rank teachers.
Ira, we just heard from one of the folks in the piece that was asking, where does technology fit into all this? And I think it's an interesting question because, one of the things that I hear people say sometimes is, that it's not about the technology when we're talking about some of the critical issues that we're putting on the table. The question was just asked, where does technology fit into this? One of the things that I had a really interesting experience in the last week, that we have a school that is a school that has struggled a bit with changing demographics, has a much higher English as a second language population now than it did 5 years ago, certainly has its load of at-risk kids, as a lot of schools that feed off of sort of urban environments do. Had an engineering fair. Now, our state SOL, standardized high-stakes test, start in 2 weeks, and just last week, they had a major engineering fair, which is an exposition of work that kids have been doing all year long with engineering. What was interesting is that, one, that this is a school that has said that this work is so important that we're not going to subsume it to the test-taking curriculum and plan to do engineering after the SOL test end. They've been working on it all year long. In fact, they believe that their kids are stronger in every one of the disciplines, the content areas that are tested on the SOLs, as a result of engaging in the work of designing, creating, building, researching, writing, presenting, all of the things that go along with their engineering work. But what I thought was interesting is, aside from the fact that they're willing to step out there and take the risk to spend their year working on real-life, real-world problem solving as an integral part of the curriculum, and then spend the 2 weeks before the SOL test doing more of the test preppy kinds of things, because they know that it's important for their kids to do well. They're going to make sure that they understand the formats and so forth and so on. But I also think what was really important from a technology standpoint is that a lot of times people define technology as being the new tools that are in their hands: computers, laptops, netbooks, mobile devices, interactive whiteboards, etc. The reality is, Ira, I know you talk about that, technology is anything that you use that's a tool that helps you accomplish something that you want to accomplish. What was fascinating walking around the engineering fair is that there were projects that were made out of very old technologies. There were projects that used new technologies like a digital fabrication lab. The reality is that technology is very much a part of the kids' lives. It always has been, going back to probably the beginning of time when people were learning. So I don't think that you can separate it out. I think you've got to look at it as part and parcel of the work we're doing. I think what's most important is you can't separate anything out and focus on it in isolation and expect to really change the game. If you send a teacher to a workshop and expect them to come back to a classroom that's set up to look like a classroom of 25 years ago, it's kind of hard to expect them to do real-world, authentic problem solving. So I think we've got to change learning spaces, teaching, the learning work kids are doing, and how we use the technologies all simultaneously, and we can't do it in traditional ways.
Well, we can't. And in the chat, there's this discussion of technology and does it solve every problem? And of course, nothing solves every problem. But my view of technology is just as Pam said, technologies are tools, and humans are above all defined as tool users and tool creators and tool adapters. There are lots of animals that use tools. I can watch bonobos and chimpanzees dip sticks into termite mounds and suck the stuff off. I can watch sea lions use rocks to crack open shells. I can see lots of tool use in the animal kingdom. But what makes humans different is that tools dominate our existence in every way. We refer to our history by our tools. We talk about the Stone Age and the Iron Age and the Bronze Age, the Age of Steam. We talk about these things because that's how important they are. Without tools, humans are a long, long way from the top of the food chain, as anyone who's been watching the Eagles in Iowa should be reminded of all the time. Humans were feed for better hunters before we developed tools. And so tools are a critical part of our lives. And the slide that's up at the moment is augmented reality. It's something that runs on my Android phone now, runs on all sorts of phones all over the place. It's the kind of way that people can walk around the city and learn things. And with a group of people, we've been playing with the idea that you'll be able to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, and using your phone, you'll be able to see the stresses on the structure if you want, or poetry written about the bridge, or photographs and artwork created from the bridge. So in other words, we're shattering the boundaries of between formal and informal education through these devices. In addition, as people have said in the chat room, you go into classrooms and kids all over the place, if they don't have them now, they surely will in 3 years, will almost all have these devices that, can access information in every library in the world, can connect them to any person on the planet that they want to. And these are a basic part of our existence at the moment. But Pam's right. What I see often is I see workshops in technology and then teachers returning to schools where technology isn't just offered, it's actively blocked by people. People so afraid of the downside of technology that they are unwilling to let any of it happen. Because there might be a plane crash, we stop the Wright brothers cold, kind of thing. And we as humans need to be better than that, and as leaders, we need to be better than that. We have to bring these technologies in, and we have to let people use them, even if it's messy, even if it's sloppy, but we have to also give our staffs time to play and experience and try and practice with things. Tech doesn't solve all human problems. It never has. There are many problems from 10,000 years ago that still exist today. But the fact is that without technology, we'd be in a very big difference. And just, last little thing on this thing, I have an 1841 book in which, the author has to argue for using the chalkboard in classrooms because teachers are resisting it as a strange new technology that takes away from the book. And he also has to fight to get students to have individual slates in their hands because people say that if you give students these expensive things, they'll break them. It's a never-ending point.
A lot of interesting chat going on around filters and personal devices and how different communities react and respond around that. I think that one of the things that's really critical, and I do want to hit the professional development piece a little bit because I think that's one of the most critical things that's a real issue for us, is that I don't think there are many educators that you talk to who would say that the traditional development modes that we've used, whether it's workshops, whether it's conferences, keynotes, are really good avenues for teachers to be able to either A, feel like that they got enough from the experience that they can actually go back and use what they have learned, or two, feel like that they've got the time to really build out the skill sets that perhaps that they would like to be able to work on. It strikes me that one of the things that we've really got to do is to take a look at how we shift the way we think about professional development. Obviously, some of those structures are ones that are so embedded it's going to be really difficult to make a shift in some areas. But one of the things that we've been finding, and other people that I've talked to that have been talking about this similarly, really see job-embedded development as needing to happen as close to the real work that teachers engage in as possible. So one of the things that Ira and I have been doing this year, and as we have spent time in schools, he's some in Michigan as well as here, is actually taking the time to just sit with teachers as they're doing the work of planning, as they're doing the work of thinking about how they want to make shifts in their classrooms, and focusing on it in the moment versus doing it as a workshop or expecting it to happen through some other format that is very much removed from the daily work, the real work that teachers do. And so I think that that's one of the things that's kind of a go with this move to a more natural leadership model that involves teachers as leaders in that actually trust that teachers, given the opportunity to make more incremental shifts, will do that pretty quickly and agilely, that it's not something that needs to take 3 years to affect some of the changes that you would expect. Here's an example of one that occurred within 24 hours after us talking with a media center specialist. Looks pretty simplistic on the surface, and I'll let Ira talk about this a little bit. In reality, this librarian will tell you that this change that she made didn't just change what occurred in the space outside the library, but also began to change things within 24 hours inside the library.
Well, this is a classic example, and it's thinking of leadership as on-the-ground collaboration with people, and leaders being one of the most important things that I do if I'm in any sort of considered to be in any leadership role is to try to bring new eyes to what people see. Pam and I walked into this school, and there was this enormous lobby area outside the offices and the media center. And they referred to it as sort of like Grand Central. They said kids just ran through it. It was incredibly noisy, incredibly chaotic. And I looked around with the librarian, and I said she had already established that she had way too many tables and stuff in her library. And I said, could we put a couple of tables outside the door of the library? That was the first thing. And maybe kids could read at them or work at them or do something or display things on them, whatever. And then I looked around, and across the corridor were a couple of benches outside of offices that looked like the kind of sort of penalty boxes that kids sit in waiting to get disciplined. And I said, what if we grab those and put those in the center of the space? And just to break up the space and to make it part of the library. I tend to say that if our schools are academical villages, as Jefferson said, then our libraries are both the central park and the downtown, and those are the most important thing. So part of my goal is to bring the library out into the school itself in a way that makes things work. She moved the benches the next day and went to some discount store and got some fake plants and put those out too. Immediately, kids started going out and using that, which changed the whole structure of the library, created a more free-form thing. Teachers then responded by bringing different grades of kids together to read to each other in this big space. They sat under tables, on benches, on the floor, sprawled out across it. And suddenly what was a barren sort of circulation space in a school became the central park of a learning community. it makes a difference. It brings learning out of the shadows. We don't do it in locked doors anymore. We can do it in public with people around and sharing things. We're also preparing our students to learn the art of choice in learning environments, which they'll all have to do in the workplaces that are appearing today. So I think that, you know, but this would only happen, this couldn't happen from Pam sending out a memo that people should, you know, create reading spaces in the schools. This has to come from being on the ground with the teachers in the space, listening to them, and then helping them find the logical solutions to their problems.
Absolutely. I'm looking at the time that we still have on the deck and wondering if there are any questions from the audience that Allison, you might want to see if anybody's got something they want to pop in and either ask on the back channel for us, or whether they might want to kick it to us over the microphone. But I do think that what Ira is showing right now is one of the more fascinating stories of what happens when teachers feel that they have the permission, the opportunity to be as imaginative as possible, going back to the 4 failures of the system. One is, do we really let our teachers and our kids imagine what could be? And this is kind of a crazy story about this one picture where the teacher was thinking about trying to figure out how to put whiteboard space on each kid's desk or table. And Ira walked in and said, gee, you know, why would you do that? You've got plenty of whiteboard space. It's called your floor. And in this elementary school, the principal was pretty cool after testing out some of the marker potential to damage the floor, to say, hey, yeah, let's go for it. And this became a blog post by this teacher, but also a really great story that Ira likes to tell.
Well, what was greatest about this was the way the kids took charge of this. So what you're watching here is that the teacher had the kids talking about what community meant. And so he had the students in groups of 3 or 4 start to draw, sort of map out what they thought a community looked at. And they all spread out across the room, did this in different places. And one of the things the kids then said was, the students, not the teacher, said, we have to build roads to connect these schools. And so they started building roads to connect them. And at probably the best moment in the day, 2 groups drawing on the floor backed into each other and actually got into a land use argument over whose land it was, which the other students then had to moderate and sort of solve the problem. So it became a lesson of sort of remarkable complexity, because everyone was freed of the normal constraints we do. And the kids were, you know, one of the things is, and we ignore this with kids of every age, is the kinesthetic power of kids moving and working with their bodies as they learn and do things. And in this case, the kids, Michael now, this 3rd grade teacher, does, I mean, the kids do math problems on the floor. They draw explorers on the floor. They do whatever they want. But they also work with Apple laptops, and they work with iPods, and they work with all sorts of different things, and paper. They draw on their desks, whatever it is they do to make themselves comfortable in this setting. And they're right. There's no way to measure with a multiple choice test the power of what's happening here. But I'll tell you something, and I've learned this through observing a lot of schools. These kids will do fine on multiple choice tests. If you let kids learn, that won't be the problem. And let me just...
Go ahead, I'm sorry. I was going to say that one of the things that is absolutely true about classrooms like this, whether it's in a 3rd grade classroom or whether it's in a 10th grade classroom, and we can go to places all over this school district and other places all over the country where kids are learning in really powerful ways in classrooms that don't look like desk and rows, don't look like test prep curriculum, and actually are kids that you would consider to be highly at risk in terms of the factors that they bring into the classroom. And that's a choice for us as to whether we choose to go down that more scientifically managed, visible numbers alone, test prep focused schooling, or whether we make other choices. The unfortunate thing is that oftentimes teachers are at the mercy of leaders who see it differently. So one of the things that we've been really trying to do is to spend time talking with people that do have the capability, the power to make shifts in the way that they implement the practice of leadership, and to get them to really consider some of the choices that they're making.
It's one of the things that Thomas Lazick, who's the one who said, his students were doing better at everything the school didn't care about, from Perth, Australia, just said is one of the things that has to go with this as a leadership model, a professional development model, is openness and transparency. I've been working with a wonderful superintendent here in Western Michigan, Dave Britton, who is the superintendent of it turns out the most impoverished district in the state. But they built, with some of their federal at-risk money last year, they built a 6th grade building that's completely transparent. Basically, you see from classroom to classroom, you see from classroom to the open general space, you see from classroom to outside. Everything is open and clear. It's sort of like working in a glass box. But what teachers do is they see what's going on and what's working in different places, and kids see it as well. It's much less distracting than you can imagine, and I go back to a great paper written by an associate of mine about the idea of gaze and Marie Montessori's classroom in the middle of the World's Fair in San Francisco, where the kids were fine if the attention is there and the work is there. But we have to make this open, and one of the things I talk a lot about is, keeping classroom doors open as a start, not covering up windows of things. But the next thing is teachers need to see each other teach. When I first began working in K-12 education, I was stunned by the isolation. I've never seen more isolated people before than teachers. They're locked away in their rooms. They don't get to work with, a wide variety of other adults. We have to create those opportunities for teachers to see each other, to share their work, to trade classrooms, to team teach together, to do whatever. Pam and I have done a lot of rounds in schools where we've grabbed a group of teachers, sometimes with students along, and walked through classrooms to see what they were like. And we have to get that going, because without that, we're really kind of stuck. Progress will happen in little fits and starts, and as Pam always says, if we don't start sharing these practices, what kids get is potluck. They either get the great classroom or they don't get the great classroom. They get the great teacher or they don't get the great teacher, and we should be better than that.
You must go back to that slide before, because that one is one of the more interesting things that occurred. This is a window that looks from a library out into a hallway. And after Ira came in and did what some people describe as that Ira is like a bungee jump, that he'll take you all the way down to the river, and then the bungee cord kind of comes back to some level, and you go, okay, this is where I can kind of live. But he threw out the idea that perhaps that every wall is a teaching wall, including windows. And this librarian in this school decided to take the risk to figure that out, and kids started using the windows as a tool for basically doing things that they were working on in terms of some research projects. This one happened to be on origami, And what was fascinating about it is that it actually spawned another research project as kids were walking by and looking at the reverse writing that, of course, was on the outside of the window. They started trying to figure out what's the story on that, ended up researching Leonardo da Vinci as a result of it, who happened to be able to write reverse writing pretty proficiently, among other things that he was good at. One of the things that I think is really critical about the role of the leader, and it's one of the things that we, as we work together and start to really expand this into more than just a night chat, is a focus on what do leaders do that really goes after one of the things that again, Deming said about what great organizations do. And he talked about, that you don't manage your organization by visible numbers alone. Obviously, if you've looked at these slides tonight that come from classrooms in a variety of different places, what you will see are people who are engaging in a quality of work that can't be represented in a numeric dashboard or reported out to the state in terms of kids' performance on some of the kinds of things that you see kids doing. But what I think is one of the most important things that we have to be able to drive out of our workplaces is the concept of fear, and that the hierarchy creates a fear of the leadership. And even in the places that I consider to be sometimes the best of places, that always sits in the back of people's mind that live in a hierarchical world, is what happens if I let the kids write on the windows? What happens if I let the kids write on the floors? What happens if I let kids use their phones in class? What happens if? You can go through a lot of those. The reality is that we've got to start taking that on, and it's one of the reasons why we believe that pitching some of this work to leaders will open the door. And I am using leaders in an administrative way right now, despite the fact that I think that kids are leaders, teachers are leaders, people that teaching assistants can be leaders. Anybody can be a leader depending on the situation and what they know. But that if we don't get our administrative leaders to start to take on some of these big critical issues that have become very much a part of who we are as a scientifically managed system of education in the United States, that we're going to continue to just build a system that ensures that some kids don't graduate, that some teachers don't ever become successful at the job that they really want to do, believe that they are called to do as educators, because we haven't built the supports in a way that really allow them to do that. I think that's really critical. I look at this and I look at kids that are in you see kids in every which way but loose in terms of the way that they are choosing to be present in schools. They're on floors, they're in chairs, they're under tables. The reality is that these kids are all learning, but they're not in rows and desks.
And it's really important as I sort of look at this is the last picture in this group, to know that this means not just students but teachers as well. When I see typical professional development, I see the kind of teaching we wouldn't want for any of our children. I see undifferentiated, non-universal, same for all, lecture kind of stuff, even when it's most well-meaning. What I love about this picture is here's a boy sitting by a bench, but not on it. He has a pencil next to him, but he's not using that. He's got a mouse plugged into his computer, but he's not using that. But he's completely 100% absorbed in what he's doing, despite the fact that there's motion around him and other students and all sorts of things going on. He's in a corridor. This is counter to all the sort of rules of the classroom that we establish. And it's counter to all the things that we expect when we expect teachers to be learning themselves. I know that, if I go to, teacher education institutions like the one that I teach on, most classrooms look mighty traditional. I know the most grading looks mighty traditional. And if I go to professional development things, I go to conferences. The last little conference I was at, walked into a room with rows of like 90 chairs facing a teaching wall, and I said, nothing will ever change unless we stop meeting like this. We have to change. We have to model the change from the top down, from the top as it exists now, if we are going to change what the top means. And Pam's things of thinking of learning is happening around caves, campfires, and watering holes, those basic natural places where humans gather is I think a really, really, critical component of this. Yes, as Tuna Guy says here, which is a great name, engagement versus compliance. If all we're trying to do is train compliant workers, which is what our system was designed to do, then we keep doing what we're doing. But I'll tell you something, and I know we're going a little bit over here. I have a son now who's 25 years old, works for Mozilla. He spent a year working for them in an office with no real assigned desks and people wandering around and a pool table and an Xbox 360 on a 26-foot screen and an open bar all day long and all the food in the world. But he decided that while he liked that, he'd really rather live in New York. So now he works from home and then manages from an apartment in Brooklyn. And he has to build that whole world himself. All of our people will for the real jobs we want our kids to have. So with that said, let me turn it back to Allison. Thank you all for coming and listening. And please, if you can, there's a link up there, and Allison, hopefully she'll post the link in the chat box to, we'll be trying to workshop a bunch of this out in Colorado in June. Allison?
Hi, great. Todd, thank you so much, Ira and Pam. I think you probably are teaching to the choir here. We'd love to have you all join us in Colorado for our Thai Leadership Conference. We have a specific Leadership Day on June 23rd as part of that conference, and I just posted the link to that. If you'd like to sign up, you can come for the day or you can come for the whole 4-day conference. Either way, but there'll be more of this invigorating conversation, and I think you have some wonderful ideas, Pam and Ira. We really appreciate you taking time to join us tonight, and thank you for everyone who attended. I appreciate you coming. Bye-bye.
Bye, folks.
Bye-bye. Thanks for coming, and go. You're the people doing it in the classroom, so I appreciate that.